Let's turn to COVID quickly, because I think this is something that's brought these issues out like really prominently. We've often been told by politicians, at least in the UK, and I assume it's similar in the US, that we're going to be guided by the science at all times, and we're going to follow the clear scientific consensus. And as someone that works in science, and I'm sure you've had the same experience, it's messy and conclusions fall in and out of, out of your beliefs and so on. How do you see this sort of politics, people deciding things and scientists interacting, evolving over the coming years?
Yeah, it's a really interesting dynamic, because the phrase, we're following the science, which is, quite common to hear from Boris Johnson and his advisors in the UK. And in the US, we hear, obviously the Trump administration has little interest in science except as a prop, that they should follow the science. But that really mischaracterizes what science is capable of. Science doesn't lead. So the idea of following the science just doesn't work, and it puts science in a really unfortunate position. What science can do, and more broadly expertise, is to inform us, what our possible choices are, what the consequences of those choices might be, and lay them out so that decision makers can actually choose among them to try to achieve desired outcomes. It is confusing when you look at a setup like the United Kingdom has, let's say, for science advice in the pandemic. The chief scientific advisor, the chief medical advisor, are they advisors or are they decision makers? And it's not quite clear exactly what role they play. There's the sage, the official sage, and now a group of former officials have created the independent sage. So there's a mishmash of conflicting types of advice, but it's not clear, particularly in the UK, what role these experts are actually playing. So going forward, and the US system is just a god-awful mess, because obviously the government, particularly at the highest levels, isn't interested in hearing advice. So I think going forward, one of the things I'll be focused on going forward is over the last several decades, we've developed, based on a lot of input from people in my field, institutions and processes for providing scientific advice to government. And this is really the first true global test of those institutions. And my first opening hypothesis is that those advisory bodies haven't done a particularly good job, and we need to go back and rethink what that means going forward, because part of it is there's public health decisions, and elected officials and appointed officials are responsible for those, but there's also scientific advisory decisions, and just because you get good advice doesn't mean you're going to make good decisions.
No, definitely.
And you can make good decisions without good advice. But I think we need to take a step back and re-examine the entire scientific advisory process that we thought we understood.
It's a really nice idea of it. Instead of just looking at let's support cause, let's try and get that particular party in power and sustain them in power for a long time. It's what can we design a system that means it will always go in the right direction. No, I think that's smart. And that ties back into the climate debate, where there's so much noise and there's so much partisan things. That doesn't necessarily resolve energy policy, for example, for the next 50 years. Right. How do you think uncertainty plays into that? So in science, particularly with things like when you're projecting 70 years into the future with climate models, or right at the start of pandemic, incredibly limited data, you've got huge uncertainty. How does that come into play in policy?
Yeah. One thing I think to understand is that science, sometimes when we're lucky and the task is simple, science can reduce uncertainties. But a lot of times, particularly if you're looking at complicated issues, long-term issues, the more we look at the issues, the bigger the fan of the future becomes. And the fact that we get surprised by things like a pandemic means that how we were thinking about the future was even too restricted. The way we reduce uncertainty is through decision making, through policy. And that's, one of the key purposes of policy making is to make some futures more likely and other futures less likely. That's the definition of reducing uncertainty. So when we talk about experts and expert advice, there's important questions like what's the transmission rate of the coronavirus? What's the temperature, 2-degree temperature change going to mean for sea level rise? Yeah, those are important questions. But I think there's another set of important questions that are, what could we do today in the UK, in the US, in my household, in this company, to make some futures less likely and other futures more likely? And integrating science, politics, policy, values, and so on is really essential, I think, to making good decisions. Because elected officials, the policy ideas don't spring, from the hand of God to their brain. Yeah, they have to come from somewhere. And I think we experts have a responsibility to help them think through and shape those options.
Yeah, them and the machinery of government as well that informs and passes it through. I like what you just said there, that what we need to do is look at what's happening today and see what we can do to influence things today. Something that often happens in climate change amongst other issues is we look at what we're going to do in 2070, what we're going to do in 2080, and try and solve the whole issue in one big step, one big conference, one big agreement. Do you want to speak on that, this idea of like what can we do today, without any innovation that might or may not happen in the future?
Yeah, I mean, the legacy, and this will be the subject of future dissertations in science and technology studies, but the decisions that we make in climate have been profoundly shaped by a particular branch of scenario planning. And this goes back to the 1980s and how we first assembled the intellectual architecture of thinking through the climate debate. 2100 has always been a fixed endpoint, I think only because it's a nice round number. It was more than a century ahead in the 1980s. So, but in the real world, not in integrated assessment models and so on, but in the real world, decisions are made incrementally, muddling through. We make mistakes, we course correct. And I think at some point, the intellectual side, the academic side of the climate debate started focusing on how do we optimize solutions and test them out inside of these sophisticated models, and lost sight of the fact, well, we need policies that are in place this year that help improve people's lives at the same time they're addressing a threat that we're aware of is essentially, develops over a very long time. And so there has been, and there continues to be, a lack of effective, common sense sort of strategies that build upon each other over time to get you more in the direction where you want. Now, the good news is that this Steve Rayner, a colleague at Oxford, who recently passed, he used to talk about the auction of promises. I'm going to reduce emissions 20% by 2080. Well, I'm going to do it 50% by 2050, which is easy to say, but no one's really accountable for those sort of things. And in the climate debate, we've seen a compression of timescales, and it's misinterpreted. But the widely held view that we have until 2030 to act, the shorter the time frame, the more practical the policy recommendations have to be, and the more accountable those who are advocating them are for their outcomes. So I think it's been good that the time frame for climate action has actually compressed in recent decades.
Yeah, no, that is interesting. That's the opposite to what I thought you'd have said. I thought you'd have said, look, there's a long time to get things done. Let's do it step by step. But instead, what you're saying is, let's move the goalpost forward and get some.
Yeah, action. I mean, it's simple to say, but a journey of 1,000 miles starts with a single step.
Sure.
And I am much more interested in not how do we get the last ton of CO2 removed from our emissions, but how do we get the next few reduced? And we need to talk about what those steps are in the short term so we can start moving in the right direction. And then we can talk about accelerating it and so on. But if we fixate on a 2050 target or even 2035, we're still not in the realm of the practical and pragmatic today.